tab here.
And maybe we want to have Tommy, who just joined us, introduce herself because she does have a startup and she is hiring.
Hi, Bonnie. Hi, Charles.
Hi, Tommy. You want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks. So I have a background in tech, finance, operations, and women's entrepreneur community work. I just finished a master's in data science. I've been working in or around the machine learning industry for 10 years. I tend to have sort of a flat management style and democratic ideals and whatnot. So that's what I'm planning to put into my current startup, which is actually reinventing the dating experience. So that's it. Thank you.
Oh, I should do my introduction. I'm Bonnie Helper. I write the weekly Startup One Stop newsletter with its, a little editorial and always helpful links for entrepreneurs. And I want to thank Work2 for hosting us. Joseph or Catherine, Christine, you want to tell what Work2 is about, restaurant co-working across the country?
Yes, we partner with hotels and restaurants across the nation to provide people with safe working spaces. With access to our membership, you have access to all locations across the US, so you can curate your work experience depending on your mood. Filters including quiet spaces or lively spaces, but we've got an array of really beautiful, unique locations for our members to choose from.
Thank you. And we host investor breakfast every 2 weeks virtually. And this week, our guest is Charles Smith. You want to tell us a little bit about your background? And Charles is going to talk about how to hire.
That's it's in the presentation. So if I'm ready to roll, right? So, so this is designed to be a very sort of hiring 101 in the sense of one of the things that I've realized in my career, and we'll get into it a little bit, is that startup CEOs often, one of the things that they've not had experience with is hiring. And startups are generally sort of desperate for help and often hire the first nice person that comes along that they think can do the job. And so, and I see some of you sort of nodding in the chat, and that's just how it goes. And I've done the same thing. So I'll get rolling here. So who are we? So I work for a fund or a fund management company called Ataraxia. We manage 2 early stage funds. The first is Social Starts Health and Happiness, and which is really about looking for companies that are helping people live longer and better lives. It's a lot of deep medical technology, but also we have a particular emphasis in both women's health and in mental health. So it's approaches both of those areas as well. And the second fund is called Joyance Partners. Joyance Partners invests in delightful moments. People will do a lot to take their mood from a -1 to a 0 or a 0 to a +1. And so we invest in companies that's mostly consumer facing. There's also a fair amount of medical companies in that portfolio, but that's really an interesting, exciting thing because we invest in happiness. So that's an interesting take on things. We believe that this is a really interesting time to invest in these spaces. We're seeing, for the past 30 years, so much technology was devoted to, and I've invested in or was a part of a bunch of these companies, but so much of technology was devoted to, enterprise SaaS, which essentially is taking away people's jobs, creates other opportunities, of course, or also consumer technology, which is about gathering data and utilizing that data on behalf of the company, not on behalf of the individual. And now we're seeing that flip where companies can take that data and utilize it on behalf of the individual, especially in connection with biology. So that's why we think this is a really exciting time. We're an early stage fund, $300,000 initial investment, all the way from an idea through Series A, and we're global. We talked about that a little bit already. So we have partners across Europe, across the United States, in Asia, and we've invested in all over the world. So why should you listen to me, in this? I'm currently a venture partner, right? Which means I'm an investor at these funds. But I've been in the New York City, in particular, startup environment since the mid 90s. I was a co-founder at two ad tech companies, which one of which was founded in 1995, the other was 2001. And then from there, I went to Etsy. And I helped Etsy grow from 6 to 75 people. I've hired globally roughly 1,000 employees, growth across the world, across those companies. And this presentation is really what I learned. How do you start a hiring process? And it's all trial and error. And a lot of the things that happen here, excuse me, are direct result of mistakes that we made in the process. And so this is where I come out of this. Please stop and ask me questions too, as I'm going along if things aren't understandable. So I look at this as you're determining whether or not you're trying to hire somebody. And how do you decide whether or not that person is right? And there are three things to me that really matter. And it really, I think the most important, and these are listed not necessarily in the order of importance, but the first thing you need to evaluate is, can they do the job, right? What job are we hiring for? Often in a startup, you don't know. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But can they actually do the job? Do they have the skills necessary to do the job? The second is, can they work in a startup environment? And many people are terrific, but aren't geared for working in a startup environment. And the third is, are they a culture fit for my company? And basically, yeah, you can make a Venn diagram, right? Okay, they're good at this, they're good at this, they're good at this, I'm gonna hire someone. And if I could do graphics in PowerPoint, I'd show you that. But so that's the idea. And so this is really about how do we determine whether or not how do we evaluate that criteria for each role? And so this is about structuring a hiring process. And to me, that's where startups don't, and I certainly didn't do a good job of this at all. And I'm really a believer, and all of my startup roles in the past were really in operations, right? I'm not a developer. I don't have great vision, but I can, sort of look around and see what needs to happen and try to do it, right? So I'm not a believer in putting too much process within your startup, right? Because that just leads to conflicts. And if you put in process before the company is big enough to actually execute the process, you'll spend more time arguing about the process and not getting the work done. So this is what I think is sort of a bare bones process to get you the fastest way to hire people that are going to contribute. And speed is really important, obviously. So it's speed to the right decision.
I want to make one comment.
Yeah.
I used to do recruiting, and you say define the role. But I find that a lot of companies, and especially startups, because they need people and they need people to multitask, they do this, which should be called a wish list of what they need. And it's usually 2 or 3 roles in one, and it's confusing. And I think that's where a lot of them get into problems. What would you have to say about that?
Well, I think that you are going to have people wear multiple hats anytime you have a startup. But I think that what needs to happen, and we'll actually get into this specifically as we go through here, is you still need to define the primary role for the candidate, or I should say for the job. And you need to define the most important thing that person needs to accomplish. And then once they get in the company, what often happens in a startup, and it's part of defining a person who can work in a startup, is that you want someone who then it looks around and says, oh, that needs doing also. I can do that, and is willing to take on that responsibility. But unless you're defining the primary function, you're going, as you're suggesting, I believe, you're going to fail. And that person is not going to be good at what they do. Through no fault of their own, right?
Thank you.
Sorry?
I said thank you. Yes, you nailed it.
Yeah. So that's how I look at it. So first, just do exactly that. Define the role. What is the thing that we are missing most right now in the company, and what jobs need to be done, right? The second is, what is the criteria for the ideal candidate? What are the things we're looking for? And again, we'll get into this very specifically as I have an example of how we do this later on. What is the criteria for that ideal candidate? What are we looking for? And the third piece, and this is something I learned through a ton of error, a lot of trial and lots of error, is I think it's really important in terms of building that early stage culture is to involve as many people in the company in the hiring process as possible. And in order to do that, and also to save your time, is to build an interview plan that is the same for every candidate. And we'll talk about this a little bit, but it's really important in my view, to think about this and how to include all the employees, as many employees as you can, but make that easy for them, right? The next piece here is find the candidates, and that is something where there's all kinds of ways to post for jobs, but startups really need to be creative in how they find candidates. And I cannot encourage you enough to work with your customer base. Every time you're about to hire somebody, talk to your customers, talk to the people who are invested in your product, and say, look, we're hiring people. Do you know someone who would be interested in this? Are you, and every company I've ever been, we hired our best candidates, not from traditional recruiting channels, but by networking within the community of our customers. And that you're upfront, people know you're a startup already. They kind of know what to expect. They understand what you're trying to build, and they have already somewhat bought in. And that has really driven a lot of success for me in the hiring process. And then, conduct the interviews and make a decision, right? And that's what this is really about, is conducting interviews is a skill in and of itself that a lot of people don't have, and you don't have time to train people to do it. So that's what we're going to talk about specifically here. So what is it and why use an interview plan? It's kind of simple, but it took me 7 years to figure out. You want to define all the questions for all the candidates in advance, right? So that you're not sitting down and looking at someone's resume and like, oh, you did this, you did this, you did this. That's not going to happen. And you end up, number one, all the work is done in advance and all you're doing is listening, right? Number two, it's a lot more impressive to the candidate. And I found that in a number of ways. People walk out and say, oh, wow, like that, like you guys are organized, you guys know what you're doing. And so that creates a feeling of confidence from the candidate towards the company. The third is, you get to all the questions you need to ask. You can actually get to the deep skills that person might have. You can make sure that you're asking the culture questions. You don't run out of time because your time is planned in advance. And so you are able to just be a much better wide picture of that candidate. It's so hard to compare candidates when you're not asking them the same questions. If you think about a group setting and, and by the way, what I would suggest is you have this interview plan and you're defining in advance. If you have them talk to, and I've done this a number of times where you have 6 or 7 people interviewing a person at once, you're defining in advance who's going to ask which question. Then when you all get together in a group afterwards, you're saying, oh, I like the way they responded to question 3, or I didn't think that they responded to question 12 well at all. And then it's much easier to compare because you're comparing apples to apples. You've asked them the same questions. Super, super important. The next one, the legal issues, is something that I never expected to have trouble with, but you're fielding, you have an inexperienced team. Often people are often in their first jobs where it's the first time they've ever interviewed somebody. And, I've had people ask like crazy questions to candidates, and they weren't being they didn't realize they were doing anything wrong, but they would, I've had interviewers say, ask the candidate if they were married. And you're just like, oh, and so this gets around any of those things, right? And you can't go off of this plan. I learned that the hard way. A lot of it, not necessarily for specific jobs, but a lot of the questions can be reused. So this seems like a lot of work, but a lot of it is evergreen. And the last piece, and very important in a startup when you're doing a bunch of things, is it's so much easier to manage your employees' time. They're committing time to do this interview, and their manager knows, they know, oh, this is going to be 20 minutes of their time in this case, and then they're going to talk about it here. And so you really have a much better sense of all the time that's going to take. And I can't stress enough that once we started doing this, specifically, both at Tacoda, which was the second startup I did in Etsy, the third was, once we got to this, a lot more buy-in within the company and participating in the process. And we hired much better candidates doing this way. And we were able to, part of it was we looked better than other startups when we were recruiting. We looked more organized, we looked more comprehensive. The candidates bought into what we were doing because everyone participated in the process, and we had an organized process. And so now, I'm just going to go through, and there's not much more to the presentation. I'm happy to take questions, but I really want to get into here, what does this really look like? And because I think it's important to get a grasp of that. And so when you're thinking about, and this is for a COO, which can be, a really important candidate. And I want to stress a few things here before I get into this specifically. A lot of startups struggle to hire engineers and developers. And this is something where the specific skills necessary for the job is a big piece of what you're looking for. And I would look for code test services. We're an investor in a company that used to be called Code Fights, where actually candidates would take code tests against one another. And so, if you can sort of outsource the skill evaluation, I would look to do that if possible, if it's an area in which you don't think you can truly evaluate the skill. And engineering is certainly one that I would look to do that. And we invest in a lot of biotech and life sciences, and the same thing. You need to find an expert that can evaluate their ability to do science or do engineering if you don't have that in-house. So let's look at this for a COO. So, what are the qualities that you're looking for a COO? Like we talked about, or I talked about before, here define the criteria for the job. Well, the first criteria here is startupness. Are they a fit for any startup, right? Can they thrive in a chaotic environment? And how do you draw that out, right? Are they a builder? Can they do the job, right? So you'll see here is the sort of the questions. The questions are here are the things that they need to do the job, and then they're all in this criteria of, are they a fit for a startup? Can they do the job? Can they do the job? Are they a culture fit, right? So are they a builder? Can the COO build something? Are they a good manager? Are they passionate about what we're building? How do they present themselves? Can they focus? Are they a leader, right? So builder, manager, presenter, these are criteria that you're looking for, right? And this is where Google is your friend. So one of the things you're doing here is okay, are they a builder? Can they do the job? And then basically go to Google and look, there's a ton of hiring questions out there where you can say, looking for search for questions that evaluate someone's loyalty, or evaluate how they're built, or how are they a manager, right? And then you're going to find questions in Google that you're comfortable with. And you simply ask those questions, right? And it seems almost, it seems like, oh wait, I should be doing more. No, why? Other people have done this already. So, utilize Google's to do this. And, there's a ton of questions out there that you can find to potentially ask a candidate. do the ones you're comfortable with, and again, once you build these plans, you can use them again. So I'm taking this, if we look here at number 6, can they focus? I'm just taking that particular one and saying, okay, I'm just going to, dive into that. And so here are the focus questions, right? And this is 6 questions that you can ask a candidate, and describe a hectic day. How do you prioritize? And this is just an example of, probably a third of, maybe less than that, of the time you're going to spend talking to the COO, or your team is going to talk to the potential COO about this, right? And you're going through here and saying, okay, look, here, before the candidate comes in, you sit down with your team, or maybe it's just you just doing the interviewing, and you parse out the questions and saying, you're going to ask this, you're going to ask this, you're going to ask this, and then you're done, and the interview rolls through with these questions. And again, this seems like it's almost simplistic, but getting this work done in advance really helps you, and you're gonna do a much better job evaluating. So and again, I'm going to go back a slide here, and then you build these 5-6 questions for every single one of these categories, and you're going to work through and figure out what's best for you, and get to the answer of the best person for the job, right? And so that's really it, right? That's how I look at hiring, at the process of hiring, is building this through, and saying, look, here's my interview plan for the roles that I'm hiring now. Here are the things that matter for this particular job, and here's how I'm going to find out whether or not this person fits this criteria, right? And and that that's it. That's what has I've done really effectively in the last. Once I figured this out, this worked incredibly well for me across 3 companies. I would say, particular at Etsy, where we were very much looking for a specific type of person that loved the community in which we were in, and really cared, because we were hiring. It was a very specific thing where the community itself had a very particular demographic profile. And so you had to really respect that profile if you're working for the company, right? And so getting to that was really important. And so we spent more time, for example, on the culture fit. Once we figured out whether or not they could do the job, we spent a lot of time on the culture fit and made sure we were very good at asking those kinds of questions and determining that and figuring out. I'm just going to stop share because that's so once we got to that, and digging through the whether or not the person was a culture fit, that became more important. And depending on what you're hiring for and how you're looking for it, you'll have different priorities. And so that becomes a way for you to put your own company spin on it. So happy to take questions. I can talk about other pieces of the hiring process, but to me, getting those basics right and getting the interview planning process done saves you time, hires better candidates, and really helps you grow as a company.
Charles, I got a couple of questions I was holding through the presentation. So you meant, I'm also a startup guy. I've been in the space for 12 years myself, so a lot of what you said resonated. I'm curious on that. You had that bullet point about getting the team involved in the interview process, which I agree with from a cultural standpoint. How do you manage, what's the right number, right? Like everyone if you're a company of 4 or 5 people, you don't want everyone interviewing everyone, or 10 people. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think that is so much of what your company culture is about, right? And at Etsy, once we got above, we did it until there were 20 people in the company. We would, continue to have all 20 people meet with that person at least for a little bit in one phase or another. One thing that's really important, I think, is however large you are in a startup, and let's say a startup is less than 200, having someone from every department involved in the hiring process, almost as a proxy, And it's what we like to do before that was essentially the department, if you will, itself would determine who they wanted in the hiring process, right? So because you want someone that the entire team trusts, and it shouldn't necessarily be the manager, right? But you want someone who people trust to come back and say, oh, because you want the person who's involved in the hiring process, if you're not involving everybody, to come back to the team and say, oh, I'm so excited about this person we're hiring. She's going to do a great job. I can't wait for you all to meet her, right? So it's as much about, building that continuity as it is, if you can't involve everybody, that's the way to do it, I think.
So if anyone else has questions, I'll stop. I have a few more questions for you because I've been through, like I said, the startups, but I've also been through the interview process, as everyone on this call probably has at one point or another.
Sure.
So you didn't touch on this, or at least I didn't hear you talk about it, on the company side, the follow-up to the interview. Like, I'll
Sure.
get back to you in 3 days, 5 days, never get back to them, the ghosting,
Sure.
like you've heard it all.
Sure. I mean, I think that it's really important to understand, and it's true, I didn't talk about that at all. And I didn't talk about the timing of all of this because it's very specific company to company, right? And so my view was that you always tell a candidate they didn't get the job if they didn't get the job. Because one of the things here is you are also building a database for people who you might hire in the future. And not everybody is a great fit when you're under 20 and needs to do a lot of jobs in the company, but they're a terrific, whether they're an accountant or a developer or whatever. And once that they can only focus on that role, they're a great fit, right? So they might not be a fit when you're 20, but they might be a great fit when you're 70. And I think one of the things that's really hard to do in a startup is to set a deadline and keep to it. But I think it's really important to do that in this case. We're going to hire this person by March 1. Now, you might not get a good candidate, right? And it's a mistake to stick to that deadline if you didn't get the candidate who's right for the job. But by communicating to those candidates, again, you're building a reputation in yourselves. Those candidates talk to one another at some point or another. So I do think it's really important. Hey, once you have that initial interview, we're back to you in 2 days, right? And with next steps. And because you've defined the interview plan in the process, is what those next steps are, right? So the team is the first interview, or your individual interviewer is the first interviewer. Then it's an interview with the entire team. Then it's an interview with the COO or the CEO, and then we make a decision, right? So that's part of that interview planning process as well, is who takes those initial questions, who does the next set, and when the decision is made. So by doing this in this way, you get to the timing of hiring that candidate much better.
I got some horror stories I'll tell you at some point.
Me too, on both sides.
What's your point of view on post-interview like projects, like certain, like use the developer example, right? Like give them a task to prove they know what they're talking about.
So I used to be very much in favor of that, and I've changed my mind on that, because what happens is companies utilize that to take people's work. And which is, it is truly reprehensible, right? We got to build this. We're trying to build this thing. We can't figure out how to build this piece of the database. Hey, maybe you can do this, and we're considering the hiring process, right? And that's why I think utilizing an outsourced company or that can do code analysis, or an expert, or looking through someone's GitHub projects, finding different ways to do that is much better, right? And I, to my knowledge, none of the companies I work with ever did that. In terms of and I used to love it for salespeople in particular, like, hey, build a presentation. How are you going to approach selling this? But really have gone the other way on that recently.
I've had to do that from the marketing side more than one time, and never ends well for some reason.
Yeah. it seems like a great idea, but then in execution, it ends up being a disaster.
So
I
I
also wanted to
actually,
mention, oh, go ahead.
good. Sorry, so
I
I
also
actually,
wanted to mention that. Go ahead, Tommy.
we're on the same page, Bonnie. Go ahead. All right, so I actually had a lot of success. I found our central developer for 2 years on a very complex project by paying people to interview so they would do real work. I paid everybody. I did it for a day. It was very easy to see who I should hire.
I love that idea. I've never done that, never heard of anybody doing it. I love it. Fantastic.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask your thoughts on maybe positions that aren't so technical or technically based, just evaluating somebody's skill set, but in a professional way. And I'll give an example from my time in hospitality, but I had an assistant general manager who made it far through the interview process, talked to like our regional VP, could speak to, P&Ls and budget and revenue. And then in the process of training her, I had to teach her how to export an email export a document to Excel. So I just wanted to get, making the assumption, looking at her resume, that she had all these years of experience, and then that just popped in at the end. So I just wanted your thoughts on how you kind of vet that without being insulting.
Yeah. So I think that specifically gets to the category of, can they work in a startup? Right? Not my startup, but in any startup, right? And it's somewhat hard for me to know exactly what questions to ask, because you'll explain and you'll understand in a minute what I mean. But when, for example, when we, the first time I started doing this, one of the questions that we asked people was, when was the last time you sent a fax, right? And at the time that we were asking that question, faxes were a big part of it was in the advertising industry at the time, and almost all the orders were still sent by fax. And so what we were finding out here was not whether or not they could use a fax machine, but whether or not they did, because if they didn't do their own faxing, they weren't going to work out in a startup, right? Because they had an assistant, or right? So that wasn't because you got to figure out, like, what are the things that you do for yourself, right? And so, yeah, I think, determining the questions which get to what are your work skills for a particular job is really important. And I don't know sort of specifically for that example how to do it. But, there is a way there to get to, how would you go about sending this presentation to the client, right? Or how would you go about and walk me through very specifically the steps of how you would do this. And right, don't be afraid to ask super detailed questions to candidates all the time. I'm going to sneeze here. So.
Allergy
Sorry.
season. Allergies.
It sure is.
So Ian and Kevin got here late. I wonder if you guys want to introduce yourself and tell us what you're doing, and if you have any questions. I know you missed a lot of the presentation, but please feel free to introduce yourself. Kevin?
Yeah, hi, how are you? Hi. I'm in real estate development and acquisitions, but interested in the startup world, and yeah, that's pretty much it. Apologies for being late. But...
Oh no, thank you for joining us. Ian?
Yeah, sure. Happy to introduce myself. I'm Ian Garmaze. I'm in Toronto. I work for a startup called Virtual Film School, and we are a live online school. We teach people how to make short videos and how to monetize them. And we're not really doing a lot of hiring at the moment, but maybe soon. So I just dropped by because I'm always interested in hearing how other people are dealing with these challenges.
Cool.
I have another question for you, Charles. It's a topic I love talking about here. The hiring side. So let's flip to the other side of the bringing the resumes in through the door. What is your point of view on the ATS industry and the systems? And should a company use them, or should the company just throw them out?
I think you're going to get to a point where you need to utilize them. And I haven't been on the hiring side in a while. And so that really happened just as I was leaving Etsy. And somewhat full disclosure, I think we were the first investor in Greenhouse. And so, which had a nice partial exit about a year ago. At some point they become necessary, but I don't have a lot of particular expertise or experience in utilizing them.
Okay, I'll just my 2 cents is, this is me personally. So if I see a company, early stage company hiring using an ATS, I almost will not apply, because I just know it's going to, someone who doesn't know how to use it has put some criteria in there, and the resumes won't get to the person who needs to really see them.
Yeah, I think what is really important in recruiting from the startup side is being as human as possible, and to make sure that the personality and the culture of the company is coming through in every I almost use the word transaction, but in every interaction that you have with potential candidates, because that's what's going to convince someone to join your team as opposed to somebody else's.
I have a question. So I wanted to speak a little bit about this market. I find I've been in touch with developers for a long time. I find it's really unique. A few things that I'm finding that are unusual, or that all my friends seem to be slammed, apart from there being trouble hiring and these incredible raises you're getting as people move from company to company, like 30K difference. I've heard many times. My friends all slammed, like they're at the senior level, and they're got, like, I don't know, it's probably not twice as much work, but a lot of work. The other thing I'm finding is that all of my friends have like 5 startups or projects or things that they're working on now, which is unusual in my experience. And my friends who are developers specifically. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. It's a very unique time in tech. Obviously, it's a very unique time in terms of startup funding. So any thoughts? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that we're starting to see valuations come down, right? And so I think that we're right on the edge of that maybe changing a little bit. But I think one of the things that's really important to think about here is, and it sort of parallels to what Joseph just asked, in the sense that you often can't compete on cash. And when someone is, entertaining offers from larger companies who are losing employees like crazy, so they're adding more money as they recruit, you have to recruit on culture. And company viability, because your stock options have to be seen as potentially being worth something, right? And so there's a temptation often to hire people on a project basis. A project basis is wrong. I don't have any problems hiring someone on a project basis. There's a temptation to hire people that are part-time, that aren't going to be fully committed to what you're doing. And again, that can work for certain very specific things. But I think it's a mistake to not fully engage with people as soon as you can, and take as much time of theirs as you can. And I don't mean that like you're spending 12 hours a day. I mean, you want people that are full-time committed, right? So that's about defining your culture and selling your culture to that potential employee. And I understand that a lot of these people want to be contractors now. And it's about figuring out what is the mix of the things that candidate wants to have in order to take the job, and how that fits in the culture of my company, and building a culture not around what they want, but around what's right for the company, and finding those people, right? Because if what you're doing is important, it's certainly important to you, you're going to be able to find other people for whom it's important. And that's why I talked about, hey, when I'm looking for employees, where do I find them? it's one thing to go on Indeed. It's another to talk to my customers. It's another to talk to the community in which whether they're on Reddit, whether they're on Facebook groups, wherever they are, finding them and saying, hey, we think you should believe in my company. Here's what we're doing. We're looking for people to help us. Can you help us? Right. And even if those specific people can't, they often will know people who can, right? Excuse me. And so that is something that to rely on is finding the community of people and networking for your jobs within that community.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly using a lot of part-time people because we haven't raised anything yet. So I tend to also have large teams, which is sort of unusual. So, and I think everybody understands sort of the process of startup a lot more now. So they're more flexible, willing to, move aside for other people at the right time. So yeah, I do see how I can be more proactive there in terms of determining fit and culture. And I think that's great. And sort of on that point, could you speak a little bit about how it's different hiring for marketplace versus other types of models that you might have been exposed to?
Yeah, I think that the great thing about most marketplaces is that they are addressing communities, and regardless of which side, right? And forgetting about the business model in and of itself is, marketplaces are created, I shouldn't be generalizing here, but marketplaces are created because there isn't a very efficient way for one-to-one, right? So you're trying to figure out how to match those people one-to-one. So how, it's getting into that, again, it's getting into that community, it's getting into the to the side of it and making sure people understand both sides, right? Because if you're hiring enterprise SaaS, one direction, they really only need to understand one piece of that, right? They really only need to understand why they're building what they're building, right? So getting to the understanding of the full sphere, if you will, of the market is something that, again, culturally is something that you want to achieve within the company. And so it's almost about showing the candidates, hey, these are the ways that you're going to be able to connect to people, right? These are the ways you're going to be able to help people. These are the ways, and it's appealing to their ego, saying, look, you're solving a problem that's unique, right? And at Etsy, one of the things that really, really worked for us was to make sure that everybody who worked in the company had to spend time in the community. Almost all the community communication within Etsy was in the forums, right? Like the world's oldest internet technology, but it worked for us. And so every employee was required to spend an hour a day in the forums interacting. And right, and so it's building those kinds of things and then showing candidates, hey, this is how you get to interact with these people, and this is how you get to help them. This is why the work you're doing is important. And so I'm not sure I addressed your question specifically, but those are the kinds of things. It's almost like you might talk to 99 people who that doesn't interest, but that 100th is so excited about what you're building and how that's working. So
I love that. I love that they spent an hour interacting in the forums. Like, that's very hard to like, as a founder, how to communicate the intuition that you have. It's very difficult. So I love that solution.
Yeah, it worked great for us. And I mean, there are downsides too, but like because everybody who worked in the company ends up sort of becoming a little famous within your customers. So
nice, cool. Bonnie, you're on mute.
I know. Before we started, we mentioned having to fire people as well, which is the other side of it, I realize. But yes.
Yep.
always difficult. And I wonder if you want to touch on that, because, you know, companies do become more mature and do need to replace people. And it's not always easy to fire somebody who was with you from the beginning.
Well, I think so. One of the things I've had a theory. Well, my first startup, we actually had a theory that you should, hire. And it's the wrong theory, but it's sort of. I think it's important to talk about. Is you almost have to fire your entire company every 2 years in a startup if you're growing, because you have a particular kind of person that's good in this phase of a startup. You have a particular kind of person in the next phase, and the next phase, right? And so you do, as a startup founder, always need to be thinking about, how are people going to react from. A lot of people like having a lot of jobs and having their hands in a lot of pies. And as the company grows, you don't need that anymore. And you don't need that, the jack of all trades, right? You need specialists. And you don't need specialists, particularly in the beginning. And you need really smart people who can do a lot. And so understanding how that moves is one, really important. And two, you're not in an environment where you're doing performance reviews all the time. You're not in an environment where you're getting and giving a lot of feedback to employees. Everything's going too quickly. So when it comes to understanding what's happening when an employee isn't performing, it often comes out in a personality conflict or in ways that don't seem performance related specifically, right? They might be meeting their deadlines, but people aren't talking. You're not seeing the interaction that you want to see. They're not communicating well. And once you start seeing that, you need to start conversations with that employee. Not that you have a probation period necessarily, but one of the things about working, and a lot of people are still using PIAs and hiring where they're not actually an employee of yours, et cetera. But having a sort of a base employee manual that you can grab from the internet somewhere, or if you're using a PIA, to have someone that has sort of rules established, number one, is really important. Number two is, look, once someone's performance starts to slip in one way or another, don't avoid that conversation. You have to start having that conversation right away. And that's not to say that you have a particular 90-day or 180-day probation period because you're never going to track it as a startup founder. I shouldn't say never. Some people could obviously do that, but the founders that I worked with never could track that. And so having that conversation is really important. And then, look, having realistic conversations with those people as soon as possible and being very upfront. You're not getting this done. And if you don't start getting it done, you're not going to be here. And then when the time comes to actually fire someone, is just being really, really upfront. And you cannot just fire someone without having those previous conversations. And once you get to the point, often they're not happy too, right? And so a lot of the easy way to, none of these conversations are easy, but the best way to start those conversations is to approach someone and say, hey, Charles, you don't seem like you're happy in your role. What's going on? And, so it's getting to getting to why they're not being efficient, why they're not happy, why they aren't getting the work done, as opposed to putting it back on the company, I think is a great way to approach it. But upfront, honest, direct, those are the things that have to happen. We find that the number one predictor of whether or not a startup CEO will be successful is how honest they are with themselves, right? And determining how you hire and fire, or more importantly, in this case, firing. Once you're honest with yourself, that you let go of the ego, and I've done this so many times that oh my God, I hired the perfect person for this job. If they're not getting the job done, you have to let that go and get rid of them quickly.
So wearing your investor hat, when you see this happening, that the founder has a hard time with this, what do you do?
Well, we try not to get involved specifically within companies, when a company is doing business like this, because we never, and some investors have very different viewpoints of this, but we are never involved enough with the company to know comprehensively what's happening. And in our view, we want to have a conversation with a CEO that says, hey, if you need to fire somebody, this is how you should do it, as opposed to being involved specifically with a very specific interaction. And you got to be careful from an investor's perspective of, having too much influence and putting yourself in a position where you're delivering a message. That should never happen. But more importantly, you want to help the CEO so they can do it in the future and not with specific incidents.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any other questions?
Yeah, I was just curious what your thoughts are on remote work.
I personally, I love it. I've been working remote for 10 years. I think that it's an absolute necessity in the world today, not just because of COVID, but because I think you can really extend the quality of the people that you hire. And as long as you're really upfront and communicative about the expectations and have the appropriate check-ins, I think it's great.
Thanks.
I saw an article recently, which I did put in the newsletter, and it was like, I think there were 10 pieces of employee monitoring, the best employee monitoring software, speaking of remote work. Wouldn't you think that that's a turnoff to remote employees who are?
Yeah, but there are some solutions that have been proposed. So if you take a look at that Reddit group that I mentioned in the chat, there are all kinds of hardware devices now that allow developers to sort of deal with that kind of monitoring, like mouse jigglers. So that they basically move the mouse every few seconds so that it looks like they're on their computer if somebody is monitoring to see if that's the case. I'm not advocating it, but I'm telling you what's going on.
So like Upwork has always had this screenshot device that like screenshots their workers every so often. That hasn't been the norm, obviously, in the US probably. But I did remember reading something about Amazon patenting their workers' workflow. I mean, I don't know. I forget what I read, but yeah.
Well, I recommend having a look at that Reddit group because you can see what a lot of people are actually doing. And because of the high level of demand right now, it's not unusual for fairly sophisticated developers to take on more than one full-time job. Believe it or not, it's happening.
Yeah, we certainly hear stories of actually developers having 3.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, it is happening. I mean, whether it's sustainable, who knows? But it's definitely a current thing.
I don't currently feel like I would use that tactic, but I don't necessarily like mind that much myself, but I can see how it can be misused, obviously. So
Yeah.
tread carefully. I do have another question when you're done. Ian.
Go ahead.
Oh no, it's a separate topic. But do you have any, how do you view the role of advisors in sort of different companies that you may have been exposed to?
So I think that, 2 things. I have a bunch of thoughts about advisors, but the first is, if at all possible, getting your advisors to invest some money in the company is really important. Now, they should get not only the shares in the company that investment would relate to, but also some stock options on top of that, or warrants, however you want to structure that. But even if it's $1,000, $2,000, $5,000, is to really bind them to the company as strongly as possible. I think is really important. The second is when attracting investments, I think that they're way overblown, except in companies that are deep science. And, because at some level there, someone who can help you evaluate the work of your scientists can be really important. But other than that, we don't ever consider who the company's advisors are when we're considering investments. There just is no way for us to do that. We're not going to call the advisors to diligence them. That's a waste of time. Calling them on or utilizing a schedule with your advisors becomes really important, I think. And it's just like, look, if you want to be an advisor, I'm looking for an advisor, but if you want to be an advisor, if you believe in our mission, you're going to commit to 3 half-hour calls, 1 half-hour call a quarter, right, for a year. And we're going to schedule them now, and we're going to keep that schedule.
There's
so the
Y Combinator sheet with it's quite extensive, actually meeting schedules. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's.
Yeah, I have actually, now that I think about it. But yes, yeah. I mean, I think that's probably a great example. So that's my thoughts. Those are my thoughts. Get them to invest, and that investors aren't that interested is what I would say.
Right. But
anytime someone. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, but they can be helpful in other ways. For instance, evaluating technology, or maybe even hiring or operationally, perhaps. Oh,
they can be phenomenally helpful to you, right? And it's just making sure that's structured appropriately, or else, too often if you're sort of relying on them and they don't have any, even if they're getting options, if you're relying on them and you can't reach them, they go on vacation, whatever, you really need to have a reason for them to participate. And anytime, if I'm an investor, if someone's, giving me a presentation about their company, often if they come to the advisors, I never do this, but mostly I want to say just skip it. It's just not important.
Cool.
I don't know. I wanted to mention that I do advise this one company, and I am a super connector. And twice they were in a hole and called me, and I pulled them out twice. You never know what somebody can bring to the table. But make sure that that person is.
To be completely, they're great for company. I am not suggesting at all you don't want them. They are great for companies. And certainly you're going to take a level of responsibility and feel that a lot of people won't. But some people just want to be involved with startups, and so anybody who asks them to be an advisor, they say yes, and then when you call them, they don't respond the way you would. So that's what you're trying to prevent, because that ends up being a ton of wasted time for the startup CEO, and then it's time you don't have.
So any more questions, comments?
It's not a question. I just wanted to make a little plug for Toronto, which from what I read is now the most rapidly growing IT employment market in North America. One of the reasons being that Canada does not have any significant restrictions on immigration of qualified technical personnel, whereas in the US there's still some restrictions. So a lot of developers in Toronto are working for US companies remotely, and many of them immigrated recently. So
is that London back there, Ian?
No, this is Toronto. This is downtown
you're
Toronto.
In Toronto. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So there's, I think the total number of tech employees grew by about 80,000 this year,
Wow.
which is pretty significant. So something to think about. And of course, it's less expensive usually than hiring employees in the US. Not always.
There's been a shift in tech hubs in the US as well. In fact, I just read an article that California has lost a considerable amount of number in its population. 46% of the population in Silicon Valley is down. 46%. That's huge.
That almost can't be right. Damn.
I read it in it was in the Mercury News, which is a reputable newspaper.
It probably depends on your definition of where they're living. I mean, they might just be commuting further.
No, it said I believe it said that they left California.
Oh, left California. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, Texas. really
I'm,
broad.
I'm
Yeah,
going
please.
to I'm going to quote this poorly because it was said to me in passing, but I think they're planning on taxing people based on the number of hours your business operates in California, something like that. Has anyone heard anything like that? So like if
I
you operate for 2 hours in California, you'll be taxed as such. That's what I heard.
You're gonna need
That was public,
you're gonna need great screen tracking software for that. Like, wow.
yeah, so I don't know. Well, I'll have to look that up.
Yeah, they have been passing a lot of legislation in California that's not exactly going to draw tech companies
Yeah.
and their employees. It's like, why shoot yourself in the foot? I don't understand it. But, tech hubs move all the time. Remember, Boston used to be the center of technology until happens all the time. So any more questions or comments or sage words of advice you want to leave us with, Charles? Since you've been down this road so many times.
I don't like to give advice. I only try to be helpful.
Okay. Well, okay, just or some thought you want to leave us with? Just asking.
I would say this. I have so much respect for people who are starting companies, and it is so hard. And putting yourself out there and driving to try to create a vision for what you want to do is so impressive. So that's why I'm lucky to be able to do what I do in terms of talking to startup founders all the time, because it's wonderful to talk to people, and so good luck. It's not easy, and I'm could not be more in awe of what you do.
So we've had investors in the past who, yes, are still investing, but have also started companies. I hate to say on the side because it is a full-time commitment too. So you've started companies. I guess you're not planning on going down that road anytime soon. or does it occur to you every now and then?
I'm not a visionary, right? I don't have, I'm not someone who has like 30 different ideas in my head all the time. It would be something if someone I knew really, really well had a great idea and I was committed to it, I would consider it. But that's not how my brain operates.
Okay, was just curious about that. So I want to thank you so much for this great presentation. It's something that all founders need, and not only the hiring process, but the firing process as well. And I want to
thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you. And thank you everybody for participating and for your questions, which are always helpful to everybody who's going to be watching it afterwards. I did get pinged by a couple of people who had last minute conflicts, and sorry about that. We have no control over that. But thank you for your time and your invaluable input. Thank you, Charles.
Thanks, Bonnie. Thanks for the invitation. I appreciate it.
And thank you, everybody. And we'll be back in 2 weeks with our next investor breakfast and hope to see you there. And thank you, WorkChew.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Charles, thanks.
Everybody have a good day.
Yep. Good to see you. Bye.